Okay, here are the edited horror stories, free of extraneous content and formatted for a more coherent reading experience. Story 1. Friday the 13th. I'm from Colombia, and this happened in 1997. At that time, I lived with my family in a town very far from any city. I was around 9 years old and used to play every day with my best friend, Josefina. At school, we loved to play in the kitchen, the beauty salon, and with all our dolls. It was a huge, imposing house, and we were always used to playing at her house since she had a large patio with mango trees. That was our favorite place to play. One day, I asked my parents for permission to go play at Josefina's house. They gave me permission, but told me I had to come back before dinner time. The lady who helped my mother in the housework approached my room and asked me, "Girl, do you know what day it is today?" She immediately answered that it was Friday the 13th, and that it was not a good day to go out, much less for the children of this town, since very ugly things can happen to them. But I did not pay attention to her and shrugged my shoulders, and left with the permission of my parents and my dolls to Josefina's house. When we arrived at my little friend's house, we went straight to the patio where she was already with her dolls and toys. It was a beautiful sunny day, so with the dirt of the patio, we decided to build a neighborhood castle and a pool, which would be perfect for our dolls. In a short time, everything suddenly darkened, and we saw how a very large black bird reached the highest mango branch. Her eyes were red, and with them she stared at us fixedly. At first we didn't pay attention to her, but then we started to get scared because she was getting bigger and bigger and started moving her wings. There came a moment that she shook them so much that our toys started to float over the tree. Josefina and I tried to run with the intention of checking her house, but no matter how fast we did it, we couldn't move. It was as if we were running in the same place. It also seemed that with its large nests that bird was making fun of us. From its beak came out noises that we did not understand, but I felt that it was something bad, since it had all the skin like a plucked chicken and a very strange cold all over the body. We cried with despair and screamed for help, but no one seemed to hear us. We only had to pray as they had taught us in the preparation classes for our first communion. With tears in our eyes, we both chose to kneel and hug each other to pray to our Father and the Holy Trinity, hoping that our prayers would save us from that terrible situation. At that moment, we heard a well-known voice that was screaming and calling us. It was my friend's older sister who suddenly appeared on our side. Our shock was great because on the one hand she was scolding us, and on the other hand we were no longer in the patio. Without knowing how it happened, we found ourselves at the back door of the house. We didn't know how we got there, but while we tried to understand, Josefina's sister kept scolding us. "Stupid girls, the whole town is looking for them. Where were they? How can they worry about everything like this? It's 10 at night. We had to inform the authorities of their disappearance. In fact, our parents are with them." We, crying, answered that we were in the patio and that we had never moved from there. He immediately told us that we were liars, because that had been the first place where they had looked for us and had not seen us. We both got pale. We couldn't believe what Josefina's sister was telling us. How could it have been so long ago? Where we had been for so long, everything was very strange and dark, so without agreeing we both preferred to be quiet and not comment anything. Our parents, upon learning, went to my friend's house. After the sermon, they punished us. And we couldn't play again until they allowed it again. When I got home with my parents, the first person I saw was the lady who told me not to leave the house. I smirked without my parents seeing it. She mimicked my earlier eye roll and said, "You see, that's what happens to children who disobey the elderly." When she said that, I realized that she had been that bird that played with us. The next day I talked to Josefina, and she told me that her grandmother had told her that an evil witch was playing with us. She did that because one of us had made her angry for some reason. It was not normal for a witch to go out in the day to do her chores. From that Friday the 13th I understood that I must obey the older people and that it is not at all good to go out on that date. My friend and I never talked about it again, especially because my family moved to the city since we were victims of the violence of that time. I lost track of Josefina, but that woman, from time to time, I still see her in my dreams laughing at me. The only thing I know is that it was the most terrifying Friday of my whole life. Story 2. Don Luis and the Witch. This story happened in the state of Hidalgo. My father's name is Lorenzo, and although he is known by everyone as Don Luis, I really have no idea why he is called that instead of by his name. It is common that my father would have some unexpected and strange things happen to him at some point in time. This story that I am going to tell is one that happened 6 years ago. I remember it perfectly when it happened. Just on New Year's Eve, when I was 13 and he was 58, he has an older sister, who is called Goya. She is older than him, so she is already an advanced age woman. She lives with her husband in the outskirts of our town, since her children are adults, and each one lives in other houses with their respective families. That night, they were sharing time with several family members from my mother's house. At 1 in the morning, my father was very drunk, as they had been drinking beer since very early in the morning. At that time, one of my cousins, the daughter of Aunt Goya, arrived. She was very worried because she had gone to her parents' house and had not found them, so she assumed she would be with us celebrating the New Year's parties. She was accompanied by her 16-year-old daughter and they both looked very worried about not knowing anything about my uncles. When I asked my mom if she knew where her parents were, my dad heard her in the middle of his drunkenness. Immediately my father answered that Goya already had a history of feeling stressed. He went out to walk towards the hill, and that didn't matter if it was late at night. And if he was looking for a lost cattle, he didn't care, he went out to look for it at any time. He was probably in the hill, just like he had been before. Surely the guys were together looking for a lost cattle. Since my dad loves them so much, he decided to go out and look for them on his own. Since he was very drunk, we couldn't convince him not to do it, and he went alone, tumbling side to side all the way. The interesting thing about the case is that it didn't take long to return. It hadn't even been an hour since we saw him arrive with his pale face, agitated from running so much. He was sweating, and something I must mention is that surprisingly when he returned, as drunk as he was when he left, he seemed completely sober. He came walking well, and even his breath smelled like alcohol. When my father returned, he stood in the doorframe and gestured to my mother to accompany him to the kitchen. My mom explained what she was doing, and my family stayed celebrating in the living room. I followed my parents to the kitchen, and well, I must say that it was the first time I saw my father in that way. He was completely pale, sweating cold, his lips were dry, and he was trembling. He asked my mother for some water. She looked scared because she saw him with a frightened face. When she asked him what had happened and why he was in that state, at that moment was when he began to tell us everything that had occurred. My aunt's house is in the upper part of a small hill. Very close is a flat land where both his plot and that of some neighbors are located. My dad says that when he arrived at the bottom of the hill, he called her several times, but no one was answering him. Then he looked towards the plots and saw a light that was somewhat yellowish that moved slowly. It was like the conventional lamps that did not have LED lights, so he thought my uncles were out there looking for the herd of sheep and goats they had. For this reason, he decided to go there. When he was about to get to that place, the light went out, and he was just surprised and had no idea what had happened to the lamp. That's why he stopped and asked loudly, "Goya, where are you?" But he didn't get any answer. He only saw a vault in the middle of the darkness, but when he approached he saw that it was only branches and nests. So he kept asking with a slightly louder voice, "Goya, where are you?" This time pointing with the small lamp that he was holding in his hand. When he did that, he could see that a woman was hidden in the middle of the nests and branches. She had her hair completely gray, which covered a large part of her face. His eyes were like bright red lights, and he was dressed in an old dirty dress. It was broken, and it was the same color as his hair. He says that because of the position he had, he was sure that thing was seeing him fixedly. He still says that he cannot correctly describe how bad he felt at that moment. He just says that when he saw that, his skin crawled and a great chill ran through his whole body. After a few seconds he could react, and although he wanted to run, he began to walk slowly backward to get away from the place. Of course, he did not stop seeing where that thing was, since he did not stop thinking that if he lost sight of her, he could not know what she would do to him and would take him by surprise. That was something that provoked more terror since she could follow him to the house, so he walked to the stone alley that separated the plots. There he turned off the lamp and began to walk with much longer and faster steps, but after a few seconds he preferred to run as fast as he could. In the distance he began to hear the flapping of a huge bird. The movement of her wings was so strong that he felt that an immense cloud of dust was rising behind him on the road he had already traveled. My family is Catholic, but he swore by God and by all the saints that what he was telling was totally true. My mother, with her same face of fright, said immediately, "Ave Maria Purissima," and told him that what he had seen was a witch, and that thank God nothing else had happened to him. I believe my father because he has never had a reputation for being a liar, and much less a cowardly person or someone who is afraid of the dark. Because on other occasions I have been to other places at late hours of the night and nothing like that had ever happened to him. He is also not someone who swears in vain or something like that. The next day we learned that my uncles had gone to the New Year's parties with a friend of my uncle's, a companion who had not visited for a long time, so they had not returned until the next day. I remember that they told him that next time they should let you know where they were going to be. Especially if they did not return soon, since they were all worried, and also from that moment on about what had happened to my father. As they did not know anything, my father recounted everything that had happened to him when he tried to find them. The reaction of my day was the same as my mother had. Ave Maria, what you saw was a witch. This has not been the only experience in which my father has been close to a witch. Something similar also happened about 2 years ago. However, that is another story that I will tell at another time. Story 3. The Twins and the Witch's Curse. This is another of the strange stories that usually occur to my family. My parents and uncles are involved in it. It was something that happened to him a long time ago, when my uncles were barely having their first baby and my parents were still dating. But it still hurts everyone. My father had a half-brother who unfortunately died of cancer. My dad lived with him and his wife, a girl as young as him. She had a very pretty sister, of which my father fell in love just when he met her. And that woman is my mother. So the sister couple married the sister couple. They were twins by double. Something very funny, of which the whole family made funny comments all the time. Before marrying my parents and when they were already dating, my uncles lived in a house that my father's brother had built for his wife. In it there was a small room where my father stayed. He began to visit my mother frequently, so he came a little later every time. Until there came a time when he always returned at night just to sleep. At that time my aunt gave birth to her first daughter. They say she was a very beautiful girl with a lot of hair. She was very chubby and very pretty, and she was barely 3 months old. But everyone described her as a girl who looked like she was of a bigger age. One of those nights, my father came home late. He had left my mother's house at 11 at night and came back to my uncle's house, which was not far, as he was about 10 minutes away. He only had to cross a few plots. My father says that when he had barely advanced 2 or 3 minutes, he felt the need to turn towards the top of one of the 3 hills that were on the left side of the road. It was as if something forced him to see towards there. When he did, he saw a yellowish light that seemed to come from the bulb of a lamp, one of those that used enormous batteries and emitted a yellowish light that was not very bright. He thought he could be treated by some shepherd climbing the hill. It was likely that he had lost some sheep or goats from his flock during the day, so he kept his way without paying much attention to the event. Until a few seconds later he saw the yellow light again, only this time he was in another hillside. That was humanly impossible, since the distance that separated one hill from another was walked in at least 15 minutes. So he ruled out that it was a person walking. It was so strange that he thought it must be a helicopter, but he thought it couldn't be either. There was no noise and it was very dark and nothing had ever happened there that required its use. He found no logical reason for the light that now bounced from hill to hill in a matter of seconds. However, when he saw that the yellow light began to descend down the hill, he remembered the stories of yesteryear. At that moment, he was sure it was a witch who wanted to take over his little niece to hurt her. He ran desperately to the house, screaming at my uncle, trying to tell him what was going on before it was too late. My father says that because he was running, he stopped seeing where he was. But when he got about 20 meters from the house, he began to yell at my uncle to wake up and go out with the shotgun because a witch was coming close. At that moment he felt air over him, and according to him, it was a strong gust as if a train was passing over him, but accompanied by a disgusting and rotten smell. Something horrible and dark had overtaken him, whistling loudly. At that moment my uncle left the house with his shotgun in his hands. They both looked up to see where that thing was, but none of them could see anything. However, they spent the whole night watching what was happening in the sky, passing by everyone around trying to find that light. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't see any of that. Soon after, it was my parents' wedding and everyone was very happy. They now live in the house of my mother's parents. My grandparents adored my father and loved him like a son, so everyone was pleased with their union. Unfortunately, my uncle and his little baby were left alone in the house. If someone had known what would happen shortly after, probably everything would be different at this time. One fatal night, my uncle was left without electric light in the house, so they lit some candles so as not to be in absolute darkness, since my uncle knew what he was doing, so he always kept himself alert. This occurred on several occasions. The night came, they were left without light, the lights were on, and my uncle was awake watching. But on one occasion he fell asleep, tired of working during the day and watching during the nights. The cold that night woke them up, and when they were going to check on the girl, she was at the end of the bed, right at her feet. She was completely pale and cold as the night and with several bruises on the back of her neck. It should be noted that the girl had died. My dad says that my uncle arrived at my grandparents' house at dawn. He cried and begged for help to save his baby. My parents and my grandfather ran to the house where my aunt was still with the girl to see what was happening. My grandmother, when entering the house, observed that all the candles that they had were extinguished. But when he asked my uncles who had paid them, no one knew who had done it. Then, when he met Elta and when he saw such a terrible scene, he said with his eyes full of tears that a witch had been the culprit of everything that had happened. Over time, my uncles managed to resign, but they moved very far. They practically went to another country before having children again. They had a daughter who is currently about 30 years old, another son who must be about 35, and finally one who is 19. He is exactly my age since I am the oldest than him by just 2 days of difference. Story 4, Witches and a Newborn. I'm going to tell you something that my family and I discovered about 3 years ago in Mexico City. Just when my younger sister was born. We were all very excited when we found out that the family was still growing. She would practically make our lives happy. The age difference between my brother and me with our little sister was considerable. I am the oldest, and at that time I was 14 years old. Then I followed my brother, who was about 9 years old, and my little sister, who was a newborn. Since my mother had decided not to have any more children, my sister was born with cesarean. And in that same operation, the doctor would take the opportunity to sterilize her surgically, On the third day of birth, they gave her a high dose and they were able to return to the house. But it was in that same hospital that my grandmother told my parents that instead of returning to our house, we could stay a few days at her house to help my father with the care of both my mother and the little baby. My parents, without thinking twice, accepted my grandmother's proposal immediately. So the first month of my sister we would spend it at my grandparents' house. We would still be close to ours, since there was only a few minutes to walk between one and the other. All our days went to visit us and meet my little sister. But there was something that surprised and scared me at the same time. And it was when a sister of my mother told her to be very careful with the baby, since the witches liked to suck on newborns until they left them dry and dead. At that moment my mother was alarmed enough, but my aunt reassured her. She told her not to worry since there were several things she could do to get them away. So at that very moment she explained some of them to her. The first thing we had to do was to prepare some things. Mustard seeds to place it on the roof. Scissors that should be placed under the pillows in the shape of a cross. Holy water that should be sprinkled throughout the house. My father tried to get all the things that same day. And before the afternoon he also dedicated himself to arranging them as he had been indicated. That night was quiet. The following night too. The third night was the same, and so a week passed. As several days passed and nothing strange happened, my father told my mother that they could already remove all those things. So we did, but when it got dark, a black cat began to meow in front of the house. At first I did not pay more attention because I saw it as something normal, since in those areas it is common for cats to climb up to the roofs. But then it didn't seem so common to me because more and more black cats were arriving, all meowing only in front of my grandparents' house. My mother began to pray while feeding my little sister, and immediately all the cats left. That was something really strange, but it was the best thing that could happen since we couldn't have slept all night with such a scandal. The next day was normal like any other. However, that night was when all the horror began. At midnight, we heard a loud thud on the roof. It was as if a huge bear was walking over us. My grandparents and my father went out in a hurry to see what was happening. What they saw left them stunned. What appeared to be an immense turkey was walking on the roof of the house. My grandmother returned quickly to find the holy water. She knew that it was no turkey. As soon as she left the house, she told my father to spray the water on that thing and on the whole roof. That she had to say many rude things, screaming as much as she could in her voice. Meanwhile, she and my grandfather would be praying. When they took that thing away, everyone entered the house very tired. It was as if that thing had taken away the energy of the three of them with it. Everyone was nervous about what had happened, so we decided to stay in the living room watching television. But soon after, all the lights in the house and the television went out. Quickly, my mother grabbed the girl and did not let her go at all, and at the door they began to hear noises as if someone was scratching the wood. It seemed as if he was trying to enter. That night, no one could sleep. When it dawned, everything returned to the tranquility of before, and they stopped hearing the noises at the door. That same day, my brother and I took care of putting everything back as my aunt had said. When it started to get dark, my mother called us to go to dinner and my brother went to the bathroom to wash his hands. When he was about to leave, he looked out the window and a huge lemur was staring at him. My brother, screaming and running, came to the dining room with hasty words and told what he had seen in the bathroom. My dad and I ran to scare him off what had scared my brother, but we couldn't find anything. I opened the window and looked out with a flashlight, but I couldn't see anything different. That animal or whatever was there was no longer there. So we went back to the dining room and calmed my brother. We had dinner and each one went to sleep in his room. That night was quiet and nothing strange happened. We thought that following the instructions that the aunt had given us had given good results. Several days passed and everything had calmed down completely. When my sister turned 1 month old, we left the house of our grandparents. We returned to our house and we were all happy because it would be our first days there with her. As both houses were close, we arrived quite quickly. Also, the day before, my dad, my brother and I had taken most of the things and we had stayed to sleep there to fix and clean everything. We only had to have dinner and go to bed, but that same night we realized that we had made a serious mistake. We had forgotten the most important thing in the grandparents' house. We had left everything that the aunt had told us to hide from what was bothering the family. Immediately my father let my brother and I run to look for everything while he took care of my mother and my little sister. In less than 15 minutes we had already returned with my grandparents. We brushed the holy water on the roof again and we also did it with mustard seeds. We put the scissors in the shape of a cross and entered the house. But being there, we heard the loud footsteps on the roof. The men left and we lit a lamp at the top. And we saw that it was the love that my brother had seen in the bathroom. In that instant he was watching me, I paralyzed. Even though I tried, I couldn't move and I remember that very well and I will never forget it in my life. My father ran him over by the door. I told him it was real. Already inside the house, my father said that those red eyes seemed to have blood inside. 3 nights of tranquility passed and when we thought that she had left us in peace, on the 4th night my little sister began to cry as if someone was hitting her. My mother tried to calm her down and it took a while to do so. In the end, she managed to make the baby sleep. So before she went to bed, they watered a mustard seed all over the house and turned off the lights. It hadn't even been 5 minutes when she heard a very loud bang on the floor. It had been my little sister. They found her lying under the bed. That's when my father despaired and began to shout all the swear words he knew. The next day my mother told my aunt everything and she told her that that was a witch who wanted to suck the baby. So he went out to buy a painting of the Virgin and some candles. Upon returning, he placed it and made a small altar where he also placed an image of Saint John of Altadeo, of whom we are all very devoted. Together, as a family, we lit the candles and prayed to God, the Virgin and our saint. In front of our own eyes, we saw how the painting of the Virgin turned red and shone a lot. So my aunt explained to us. Okay, here are the horror stories extracted and edited from the provided text, removing the intro, outros and irrelevant information. Story 1 with that, the witch would never return to our house, and that was really effective. Our aunt was right because the witch stopped bothering us. Although sometimes we see the enormous lemur walking on the roofs of the neighboring houses. Story 2 what I will tell you did not really happen to me. It is something that happened to one of my best friends when she was just 16 years old. She returned to her house after finishing her classes at school. I must comment that in the town where we live, Alto Mochi, located in Trujillo, Peru, there are many stories about ghost appearances and especially witches. One of these stories tells that witches are usually seen at 12 at night, flying their broomsticks. But that if they are desperate for something, it is also possible to see them at 12 at noon. My friend told me that on a Saturday, she had gone early to the house of another friend to do a job that they had assigned him at school. But that he had finished early, so he went back to his house to go for lunch. When he was walking, a lady approached him who scared her, since she seemed to have left out of nowhere. However, she told him not to be scared, that she was not going to do anything wrong, that she just wanted to know the time. So my friend looked at the clock and answered, "It's 12 o'clock in the afternoon, ma'am." He looked up to see her face, but his surprise was great since she had gone in the same way as she had arrived. It seemed that he had vanished right next to him. She was a little afraid, but she felt a gust of wind over her head, so she looked up to see what it was about. There she was, she panicked. That same lady who had asked for the hour seconds before, was a witch who was flying in a broom. She tells me that she was embarrassed to tell this story to someone, and that she thought that if she did it, they would make her crazy. That's why she hadn't said anything until that moment. She decided to tell her story because something similar happened to her recently. At 26 years old, she still remembers what had happened to her, and she always had the feeling that they were watching her. It was as if they were preparing her to live the experience again. Last week, she was on the road doing her job when suddenly the same lady who had seen Kejaves appeared in front of her and asked her again the same thing. Miss, please, can you tell me the time? My friend says it was cold. It was 12 o'clock noon, and she was sure it was the same lady. However, despite her fear, she paid close attention to what she said afterwards. The lady told him that she looked a lot like a girl who had had a high march, which always wore white roses. She was a girl of barely 6 years old when she had died in a traffic accident. The next day she went to visit me to tell me everything while crying. She told me that she had always dreamed that she had an accident in a car, but that after what the lady told her, she couldn't stop thinking that she was the granddaughter of that witch. Story 3. The story I want to tell is about a witch. It is something that happened in the early years of 2018 in Nicaragua, when I was about to turn 15. By then my father already had a farm, but we still lived there. However, sometimes we would stay there for a few days, generally on weekends, on holidays, and on holidays. The people who worked at the ranch had already told us that at night they saw light spheres inside the corrals, but we didn't believe much in stories like this, so we didn't take it into account and even forgot about it. One day, while we were away on vacation, a cousin called me, and they made us want to go to the bathroom. But as something was far from the house, we had to go through some hills with a flashlight that barely lit. When we were about to get to the bathroom, we both heard the licking of a bird. At that very moment, the bathroom door sounded very loud, as if someone had knocked it as if they wanted to knock it down. We both stopped very scared and we kept watching, as if asking ourselves with our eyes if we really had so much energy to urinate as to keep walking to the bathroom. We filled ourselves with courage and kept walking. But when we got to the bathroom door, we saw the shadow of a bird, so we thought we shouldn't worry. So my cousin entered first while I grabbed the old door. In that, I heard another squeak, and I started to get scared. Then I lit my enredador to know what it was about. When I suddenly looked to my right and saw that there was a huge black dog about to attack me. His eyes were red and seemed to have hypnotized me since he did not react. I was shocked, but I managed to react when I saw that he was getting closer and closer to where I was. I went to the bathroom with my cousin, and she got scared and asked me what was going on and why I had entered that way. I was speechless and could only say, "There's one thing. A black thing out there." Both scared, we began to scream, asking for help. But apparently no one heard us, and we lasted like this for several minutes. Until we heard the screams again, but this time they seemed to move away. In the same way that the screams moved away, we heard how some steps on the floor were approaching the bathroom. Suddenly, what has scared us the most in all our lives would happen. Through the holes that the old door had, we could see a huge black hairy hand. Although we kept screaming, we only heard a macabre laugh. When we already thought that was about to happen, crying, we hugged and started praying. We thought that no one would save us when we finally heard a couple of unknown voices. It was my brother and my cousin. They both asked us what was happening to us and why we were screaming so much. We opened the door, ran out, and almost fell. But our instinct told us that we couldn't stop running until we got home. When they saw us so scared, our brothers ran as fast as we did without asking us a single word. When we got home and closed the door, we told them everything that had happened to us. And as we looked out the window, we saw that near the bathroom, there was a huge sphere of red light that was moving away. From 10 to 11 at night, we don't go to the bathroom. And if we do, we always do it accompanied by adults. Story 4. Before I tell you a little about my life, I want to comment that I am a 35-year-old man. My name is Fernando Martinez, and I am a worker, and I live with a family that I have already formed, so I do not need to invent any story. Everything I tell is real experiences that have occurred to me as a child looking for the people of Tlacat, San Luis Potosi, in Mexico. I'm going to start from the beginning. When my parents were young and my older brother was 1 year old, I was on my mother's belly. At one point, they went to visit my maternal grandparents in the town where I grew up. They arrived late at night, and it was all dark, since the town did not yet have a public light. But when they were about to arrive at the house, a more powerful light than the headlights of the car lit them up. It was a bright light that had dazzled them. The car went out and did not turn on again. So they held my brother in their arms, sleeping, and walked to my grandparents' house. At that moment, my grandfather ran out of the house so that they could run to Jeff. Both were scared and obeyed him immediately. Although he did not know what was happening, they were sure that it was nothing normal or anything good. After running into the house and entering, my grandfather came out with a machete and said to himself where the light came from. He had the whole intention of discovering what that was. According to him or that, it was a pair of witches dancing on top of a tree, but no one believed his story on that occasion. Time passed and I was born, and by then I would be about 6 years old. The whole family was at home with some neighbors on vacation, so I always went out to play with my cousins. On one occasion, I was tired of playing and went straight home to the kitchen to get something to drink. When I got there, I saw that my mother had a big bottle of soda from Coca-Cola on the table. When I was ready to serve myself a big glass, my mother told me that I couldn't. That was to be eaten with the food, so instead of that, she gave me a big glass of cold water. I remember that I was upset about it and that I lay down with my arms crossed in front of the glass she placed on the table. While my mother was cooking, a few seconds later something incredible happened. The level of water in that glass went down to almost empty. It was as if someone had put a little pot and absorbed all the water. I told my mother in a fright, but she never believed me. On the contrary, she told me not to keep joking about it since she knew that I had drunk it. Years later, also playing with my cousins and some friends during a vacation, we were in the milpas, and we saw a group of about 15 or 20 sub-hotels devouring alcohol in the distance. As curious children we approached to see better what they were doing. But when we were closer, we were surprised that 5 of the top pilots were huge. They were even taller than us. They were also the only ones who turned to see us. Immediately a feeling of fear took over us. When they saw them in detail, they had the body like that of a bird. But the strangest thing was that they had heads like that of people. They looked at each other only for a moment. I could swear they were talking to each other, but they immediately stopped doing so and started running to where we were. The first thing they would grab would be me, and not because I stumbled between some grooves in the milpas. I can swear they would have taken me in their claws. Every so often I turned to see them until they stopped chasing us for a moment, and I saw them return to the place where we had initially seen them. We were sure they were chasing us, so we stopped for a while to rest and we commented on what we had seen. We all knew that if we told it to someone else, they wouldn't believe us and would make fun of us. And if they were our parents, they would surely scold us. So we decided to keep it a secret. When we were about 8 years old, living in the satellite colony in the city of San Luis Potosi, one day I was playing in the yard with my brother and we saw an object pass just about 2 meters above the ceiling. It was a small object and something that looked like the ring of a bicycle. It was less than a meter and inside it rotated some propellers like the ones that helicopters have. It moved very low and slow so we could run after it for a few minutes. But after a while it ended up getting lost between the rooftops of the houses. In that house we often woke up with big bruises all over our bodies. One day my brother and I woke up sleeping at the door of the house with our feet towards the entrance. It was as if someone had dragged us there to get us out of there, but we couldn't cross the closed door. Another time at my house it happened that during a night when I was around 11 years old, I fell asleep next to my mother. Later that night I felt as if someone was talking to me, but it wasn't a normal voice. It was like something that was knocking on my head, although I don't know how to explain it really. When I woke up I saw someone standing right next to my bed. He was dressed in black looking at me. He had to be very white because I could look very well at his face in the dark, and he had very fine features. I would swear it was a woman who still inspired me a lot of fear. So that made me want to wake my mother up, and that thing didn't take my eyes off anything in the world, and it didn't move either. I kept trying to wake my mother up, but even though I pinched her, I even pecked her with all my strength, she never woke up. I covered myself with my blankets, dead from fear, since the face of that thing kept looking at me. That's the last thing I remember of that night. The next day at the table during breakfast, my father had just arrived from the store and told my mother that the neighbors were saying that something or someone was running through the rooftops of the houses. Apparently, some of them had called the police and the street was full of patrols that night. In that same house, I also had the most terrifying thing I've ever lived. That happened a few days later. My mother and I left the living room to the kitchen that was separated by a wide corridor, and which also gave view to the backyard. I was behind her when I looked back and saw that something black had fallen from the roof to the ground, as if it were a little black kitten, which had fallen near a sink that was there. But when I looked up, I think I saw what was his head, because the only thing I could see was the reflection of the light in his eyes. I, curious, stopped to wait for it to come out when suddenly behind that sink that thing got up. It was so big and black that it could hardly be divided into darkness. The only thing that revealed its presence and location were its large yellow and orange-colored eyes. It was huge. It was about 2 meters long and was as big as a bear. I was stunned for a few seconds that seemed like hours. I didn't know what I could do, and while my mother moved away from the kitchen, when I managed to react, the voice had left me. I couldn't talk and immediately began to cry of fear. I jumped, I knelt, and when my mother saw me in that state, she came back and grabbed my arm. Then she took me to the kitchen where my father was. Crying, I told them about the enormous figure I had seen. They just looked at each other as if they knew, saying with their eyes that I was crazy. It was the most horrible thing I've seen in my whole life. The last strange thing I remember happened to me when I was 14 years old. I was playing in the yard with my dogs one day when my mother called me and showed me something that had just been taken out of one of her hyenas. She always thought that little dark spot was a little moon. When she touched her face, she felt that something was sprouting from that spot. It was something dark and she could grab it with her nails, so she took it and started taking it out little by little. When he finished taking everything out, he realized that it was not a lunar. In his place he had taken out what seemed to be a small, strange colored stone. Then we could confirm that since he placed it in a metal drawer and in effect, it sounded like a stone. Unfortunately, a few days later, my father began to feel great headaches and later died. Then it was known that the middle of his brain had small stones, very similar to those that my mother thought was a moon. Then I got a little pebble out of the tip of my nose. These have been my experiences. I hope they have been interesting for you. Story 5. I want to tell you a story that happened to us recently. I live in the state of Hidalgo in my in-laws' house. It's a very big house, and in it live my in-laws, my brother-in-law with his wife and his baby of just 5 months. Obviously, my husband and our children and I live there. It's a very nice place with very good neighbors. We all seem like a great family. One of my neighbors, the one who lives right in front of us, he sells Mexican snacks. One day I went to buy him something and he told me in a worried voice, "It's good that you came. I haven't been able to tell you what happened the night before." When I heard those words, I imagined that he wanted to tell me something that had happened to her. However, what he told me left me completely frozen. He told me that on a night when the dogs in my house and the dogs of the neighbors were barking a lot, his wife looked out one of the windows of the rooms. When he heard it, he thought the dogs were luring a stranger who could be a thief. So he tried to observe everything very well so that no detail could escape him. When he told my neighbor what he had seen, he couldn't believe it himself. His husband told him that he had seen a huge black-colored shell in the attic of my house. At first he thought that he was seeing things in the dark of the night. But then he realized that it was not his imagination. He had just told me that he ran to tell my mother-in-law with the same speed she took her Bible and took it to my brother-in-law so that they could have it in their room with the child. Que por cierto no estaba bautizado todavía a partir de ese momento nadie ha vuelto a ver nada extraño y tampoco los perros han vuelto a ladrar de esa manera aún no sabemos que fue todo aquello. Algunos dicen que se trataba de una bruja pero no estamos seguros. Quisiera que alguien que sepa del tema me dijera si esa fue una bruja o que podría ser. Nunca me hubiera imaginado que porque el bebé no estaba bautizado pudiéramos tener una visita maligna en la casa, but it seems that this is how it happened. Story 6. I am Luis Angel Morales from Monterrey, Napoleon, and in my life I have had several experiences with witches. Each one I will tell you by remembering. One of them happened to me when I was approximately 22 years old. I remember perfectly well that it was a Friday. My wife and I were getting ready to sleep, and since our girls were still little, they said they were afraid to sleep alone. At first we thought it could be because they weren't baptized, so they would often stay with us in the same room. Back then, my wife and I used to sleep with the TV on all night. So the room wasn't that dark and we could see the girls all the time. My wife, the type of person who goes to bed very late watching movies, that night was no different. At least in that sense. That night, when the girls and I slept, we heard a loud noise on the roof of our room. It was like the high of the morning when the noise suddenly woke me up. As my wife was awake, I asked her what had happened, and what was that noise so loud that had woken me up. She replied that something had fallen on the ceiling, and that later it had started to run from one side to the other over the entire room. It was something very heavy because each of its steps was clearly audible. I immediately imagined that I could be a witch by the exact place where they stopped. It was above where our little twins were sleeping, and at that very moment they began to hear desperate creaking like wanting to make a hole in the ceiling. I can't deny that the situation scared me a lot, although it was only 5 or 10 minutes that lasted the noises on the ceiling. Then everything was calm and we left the light of the room on, and neither my wife nor I could sleep in what was left of the night. After about 1 or 2 months I had another experience with another witch, or what I think was a witch. Maybe it was the same as the previous time, but I could never know. By that time my wife worked at night in a restaurant. She always came to the house between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. One of those days I went out to buy something to eat and I took the opportunity to buy some beers, since that same day my mother-in-law stayed with the girls. When I finished eating, I went out to the patio of my house to drink something fresh and wait for my wife to arrive. It was already like 1 in the morning when I sat in the dining room to drink a couple of beers, just as I always did. Total, that day was the same. It was like 2 in the morning when something different happened this time. I arrived on the mosque tree that we had in the middle of the patio. I began to hear the loud sound of a pair of wings. It was as if there was a huge bird that was flying over the mosque tree. That also made me very weird at the time because I had heard leeches, but the sound of that bird was different because it had more strength. The moment I started to realize what it was in reality was when I could really look at the figure of that thing. It was about 80 centimeters to a meter. It was a giant black bird that had the ability to immobilize me. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything. At that same moment, I heard some words, but I couldn't understand what I was saying. The noises that seemed to say something turned into scandals and dark laughter. Without realizing what was happening, the huge bird got up from the ground and, when I finally recovered the movement of my body, the first thing I did was try to enter the house as quickly as possible. I still felt as if something was looking at me. But no matter how I turned, there was no one behind me until I saw him. He was on the roof of my neighbor's house. It was a big black vault, but this time I wasn't afraid. When that thing realized that I was looking at him, it started to go back until I lost it. Fortunately, it didn't appear near the house again. Story 7. I'm originally from Cuernavaca, Morelos. I live in a town called Utepec, about 30 minutes from Tepoztlan. Since I was little, I heard that something was running in the house's lawn in the patio. Sometimes I heard that they came to knock on the house's door. The strange thing is that they always did it 3 times in a row. But that was really something that happened so often that we got used to it all. However, that's not a big deal. Since then, when I was 18, something happened that to this day scares me a lot. In fact, I had never lived such a terrifying experience. One day I went out with friends in the car of one of them. We went for a walk and bought some beers, and between talks and laughs, practically time passed. It was already past 3 in the morning and I had spent my time at home. I knew perfectly well that they were going to scold me. I got home and my cousin hadn't left me a light on. I had turned everything off, and apart from everything, the door closed for me. However, as I could open it, when I entered the room where my cousin, my aunt and I slept, I realized that I also had a key. That's why I had to sleep in another room where no one slept. That room was next to mine, but it didn't have a door. When I was about to go to bed, I heard a loud noise and then some macabre laughter. It was a laugh that was funny and terrifying. It was the laugh of a man, so I paralyzed myself from fear. A cold chill ran through my whole body. I felt that whatever was laughing at me was getting closer. I started to laugh, but it didn't go past the Father in heaven. It was as if the mind was going to get cloudy and forget everything. The more I tried to pray, the more he was laughing at me. I got up and asked God not to leave me and that I was in his hands. I got up from my bed and I don't know how I got to the door of my room where my aunt and my cousin were. I screamed as hard as I could, but the laughter was getting louder and louder. When I felt that the laugh was funny, it was already behind me. I didn't have the courage to turn around to see what it was about. I was very scared, and when I felt that she was about to grab me, my aunt, who was waking up, told me and saw me. "What's wrong, girl? Are you crazy, or why are you touching like that?" I told her what had happened to me, but she just told me, "Do you think it's good to walk around this hour?" Of course it's not good. I just got into my bed and covered my head with my feet. I never heard those laughs again. My grandfather says it was in Nawal, and here it seems that this type of stories are very common, since there are still witches and Nawals in the area. Story 8. I am from a community in the state of Guanajuato, Mexico. I have 18 years. Throughout my life I have had several experiences with witches, but none as strong as the story that I am interested in telling. I do not know exactly what happened since it did not occur to me, but the family of the wife of one of my uncles is a bit short, but it really happened in a place where they lived just the outskirts of the community in which I currently live. The house where my aunt's family lives is a little far from the road, so it is one of the few that are found in that area. It has very few neighbors and the houses are very far from each other. This family is made up of the father named Seraphin, the mother named Ramona, and her 6 children, 2 men and 4 women. At that time, her older son, also called Seraphin, was very restless and naughty. His early rebelliousness made him often fight with his parents. However, they had other more important occupations to do, instead of attending to each of the little 7-year-old Seraphim's brutes. On certain occasions, the Seraphim's parents were arguing with him because he had arrived very late to the house. That worried them a lot, since everyone in the area said that there were witches out there trying to steal their children. The naughty boy, in one of his usual attacks of rebellion, threatened his parents with leaving the house now. He knew he was doing what they were most worried about, but he was not at all stupid. Hurriedly, Seraphin left the house, but hid inside the pile of rusted or dry cane, so that his parents could not find him. They were going to be scared, thinking that he had really escaped from the house. When the parents noticed her absence, they were very worried. They immediately called my aunt on the phone. She was the only one who could help them find the little one, since she was. My aunt was the only family member who had a car, and there wasn't much public lighting in that area. It was very dark, and the vehicle's lights were the only source of illumination. With her, I could travel a greater distance, and probably while my aunt was on her way to Ramona and Seraphine's house, they would run into the little pervert on the way. However, as my Aunt Margarita arrived, the distressed parents decided to start the search for Seraphine around the house. But terrified, they saw something they did not expect. Around the house, they noticed the presence of 5 fireballs. They were all flying in circles around their house at a low altitude. Then they began to climb and fall at great speed, so the parents could not even take a single step outside their home. The lights approached the door of the house more and more, but suddenly they stopped doing so, and began to surround the piles of dry cane where, without their parents knowing it, little Seraphim was hidden. Given the macabre experience, the spouses began to pray. Everything indicated that they were witches and wanted to take their child. They would not allow that, but what worried them the most was poor Seraphim. Where was he? Alone and with that terrible danger looming over him. At that moment, my aunt and my uncle arrived in their car, impacted by the dantesque scene. None of them could believe what their eyes were seeing. They were almost as paralyzed as the anguished parents. Thus passed some 10 or 15 minutes. But at the end of all the praying, everything ended when the lights went away into the mountain. Fearing that the witches would return, the parents and my uncle went to look for Seraphim as quickly as possible. They didn't have to look much, since he himself came out of the hideout where he was. They all talked about what happened, but he just responded that he had heard everything. He emerged pale and cold. He trembled while he walked crookedly. Later, when he was home, he said he was terrified when he heard the witches calling him by his name, while they flew over the place where he was hiding. Seraphimas never escaped home again. He stopped being a pervert and became the most obedient child of all. His parents never again had problems with him, as in any other community there are tales related to witches. But for the surroundings, the Talama's experience was the most unusual and scary of all.